Well, the air travel industry seems to be going through a major transformation from security to flight financing. For a closer look, let's bring in Seth Kaplan, managing partner at Airline Weekly. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Rachelle.
So let's start with an overview of the current state of the global aviation industry.
Yeah, well, airlines around the world, generally speaking, are doing rather well. Just this week in our newsletter, for example, we published the ranking of 75 airlines' profitability. And really the noteworthy thing, although there was a wide range, is the fact that there were so few airlines that are unprofitable. You went back a decade, and there were a lot in the black, but also a lot in the red. Really now, it's just those sort of few at the bottom that are really struggling. And the other thing that's changed really in the past several years is that U.S. airlines now are among some of the most profitable in the world, whereas back a decade ago, back when there was a lot of red ink, a lot of that red ink was being spilled in the U.S. Now the U.S. doing particularly well, but a lot of other regions doing rather well too.
Now, we are expected to see a lot of growth in Asia Pacific. So what can you tell us about China's plans? We know they want to expand some of their budget and low-cost airlines.
Absolutely, and that's a huge, what looks anyway like a huge opportunity for China because, when you're talking about sort of per capita airline trips, China's still rather low compared to a lot of other countries around the world. And one reason, although certainly not the only one, is the relative lack of low-cost airlines. They exist. They're Spring Airlines, perhaps the most notable of them. But when you look at the growth in a place like North America, like Europe, the growth hasn't been at what we call the legacy airlines in general, airlines like American, Delta, United, right. Air France, KLM, the British Airways, and so forth in Europe. It's generally been those low-cost airlines who have managed to lower the cost of travel and create a whole new market for people who couldn't afford to travel in the past.
And speaking of Europe, we know that over the past couple of years, it really has been plagued with a lot of air traffic control strikes. In terms of the cost and what Europe is actually trying to do about this, what are we looking at?
Yeah, well, it's one of these strikes can cause all kinds of damage. I mean, just a small one, into the tens of millions of euros and beyond for one that lasts longer. So really the lack of labor peace in Europe, not only at the airlines itself, but yes, at the air traffic control regimes. And airlines are willing to pay a certain amount of money to buy some labor peace. But they're pushing for sort of a more unified system there where you don't have all of these individual national air traffic control regimes where, something going wrong in one country can really throw things off. Obviously, the labor unions in a lot of those places are very much against that.
Now, let's also, of course, look now to the Middle East with the diplomatic row in Qatar and even them trying to foray into this, looking at American Airlines buying perhaps up to a 10% stake. What's happening in the Middle East there?
Well, that's sort of the flip side of what I said before, where I said, the U.S., a place where, things are much better than they once were. Other regions to varying degrees, even other parts of the developing world, like Latin America, coming back. The Middle East is really the region where things are going very much in the opposite direction. And it has to do with the oil bust. It has to do with just all of those cheap fuel prices, which actually cheer airlines in most of the world. That means just much less revenue flowing into that part of the world. And those airlines, and at this point, people all around the world know them. Emirates, Etihad, you mentioned Qatar, are to one degree or another, to varying degrees for the three of those, cutting back. And when they cut back, that impacts the entire global airline industry because a lot of the growth in the whole world has really been focused on that region. And now that growth from the perspective of their airline partners, from the perspective of competitors, of manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus, it's going to have to come from elsewhere.
Now let's also now look at the U.S. We saw Trump's privatization plan, obviously not going so well according to what we saw with the Senate. What's the likelihood of some form of privatization going forward?
Well, it's a lot more likely now than it was a year ago, simply because of who's running things. It's Republicans obviously in control not only of the White House but both houses of Congress. On the other hand, as we've seen in other realms, that doesn't guarantee that they can necessarily get through anything. And it's not as if they all speak with one voice. There are various constituencies within the Republican Party, which is why other things have struggled to get passed. So more likely than it once was, particularly with the backing of most of the U.S. airlines who have basically said, this system doesn't work, let's do something else. But you have Delta, with a major voice, basically said, hey, just because this isn't perfect, it doesn't mean that anything's better than this. It would be possible, from Delta's perspective, to make things even worse. And they're saying, let's tread lightly here.
Now, as we do see growth in the industry, we also saw that at the Paris Air Show, a study by CAE said the world will need about 250,000 new airline pilots in the next decade to offset the losses from pilots retiring and this growth that we're seeing in the industry. How prepared is the industry for this, though?
Well, there is a shortage in a place like the U.S. in particular. It's driven by different things. The retirement, certainly, in some cases, in the case of the U.S., by new rules, where it's basically become much more difficult to become a pilot, more expensive to become a pilot if you have to sort of fly a lot of basically unproductive hours before you can start making money. And so that, too, has created a shortage. We'll see. That's another one, too, where, not to sound like a broken record, but I mentioned the Arabian Gulf. You watch a region like that because that's up until now what's created a lot of the demand. And that's where a lot of pilots, when times were tougher in other parts of the world, they always knew they could go there for a job. If things slow down there a lot, then that could sort of put things back into balance, sort of good from an airline perspective, not maybe quite as good from a pilot perspective. But right now, pilots are very much in demand. If you're a commercial pilot, you can get a job somewhere in the world, and it's probably going to pay pretty well compared to what it has in the past.
Well, certainly some good advice for new graduates coming out. Thank you so much, Seth Kaplan, Managing Partner at Airline Weekly.